Hello, everybody. It's Colin Talbot, and today I'm going to be talking to Professor Andrew Massey, who's Professor of Government at King's College London. Andrew produced a book, as the first edition was published in 2019, and it's come out in paperback since, on the research agenda for public administration. We've been planning to have this discussion for about a year, but COVID's got in the way, but we finally got round to managing to arrange it. So welcome, Andrew. Maybe
Colin,
you could just say something for our watchers about what you do at King's.
Yes, about a year ago, King's set up a new school, the International School for Government, with the intention of providing executive education at a postgraduate level for Crown servants within the United Kingdom and its islands, but also much further afield, public servants and civil servants around the world. And it's so far been providing postgraduate modules, certificates, diplomas, and sooner a master's for people in the United Kingdom, or for nations of the UK, plus the United Kingdom itself, the Channel Islands, Rwanda, South Africa, Argentina, Malta, Gibraltar, and I think we're busily setting up courses for people much further afield. And I'm the education director of that, and the executive director is a former politician called Alexander Downer, who was the Foreign Secretary for Australia, and then for a time was the head of I was going to say ambassador, but of course in the Commonwealth they're not ambassadors, they're
High Commissioners.
High Commissioners. Yes, yeah. Sorry, I'm groping for the term there. High Commissioners to the United Kingdom.
Right. Okay, well, let's start on the book. It's called a research agenda for public administration. So maybe we could kick off by you saying something about what you think the top items are on the research agenda for PA.
Yes, and it's a simple question. What should be at the top of the agenda? And it's actually quite a difficult thing to answer, and it depends on where you are in the world. And so when we were putting the book together, I asked a lot of people who are from different parts of the world and who are active in research what they thought was at the top of the agenda, and it did vary enormously. The East Asians, in particular China and the Republic of South Korea, had a particular view. The Australasians, another view, somewhat different to the United Kingdom. The Europeans, another view, and of course the North Americans, another view. But I think when it all came together, one of the things that's come out of the book, and I know that not every single author in the book would agree with this, but what came together for me is the need for methodological promiscuity, that we can't say there is one right way to carry out research into public administration, because the demands and the problems and the issues in research, and of course in the delivery of public services, vary enormously according to the context of where we are.
Absolutely. One of the interesting challenges that Al Roberts from the States, well, he's actually Canadian, but he works in the States, has issued recently, is saying that he thinks that too much of public administration, though, has been concentrated on the Anglo-American and European experiences and not enough on other parts of the world. So I wondered if you could say something about that and the coverage that you managed to achieve.
Yes, I would agree with that. When you look at the fact that China and India together constitute over half the world's population and a rapidly increasing part of its economy and its political power, I think it's incumbent upon us to learn more and for those countries to tell us more. And I asked one of the leading scholars in China on public administration from Tsinghua, Professor Lan, to answer these questions. What should we be researching? What are the important elements? And he provided a very interesting chapter on the different stages of Chinese public administration development ever since the People's Republic was formed, up to the new President Xi approach. So we can learn from that chapter how these thoughts have developed and how they are going to be taken forward under the Xi regime. But aside to that, I also asked a former president of the International Institute for Administrative Sciences, and indeed a former minister from South Korea, Han-Soo Kim, who is a public administration scholar, to look at the comparison from the experience of modern South Korea, Republic of South Korea, by which we go from the 1979 democratization, compare that to Japan and the experience in China too. So he's given a very nice way in which we can understand the developments in Japan post-Second World War, the developments in China within the context that sits nicely next to land, and of course the democratization developments within the Republic of South Korea. And I think there's a lot more that we need to learn, but of course most scholars in the West and in the Anglosphere don't read Chinese and don't read Korean, and probably more of us should.
Yeah, I found those two chapters really interesting, and particularly it's something which I knew a little bit about, but there's a lot more in them about the massive growth in public administration, teaching, and research in the People's Republic of China, which was astonishing. One thing that's always puzzled me and isn't really covered in the book is the lack of study of Indian public administration, which you mentioned just now, and I've never really got to the root of why that's the case, because India's the largest democracy on the planet, or at least quasi-democracy. It's at the administrative elite level speaks English and writes in English, and I've never managed to figure out why there's so little scholarship on Indian public administration.
No, I agree with you. Now, for example, the late O.P. Devaldi, who was Indian, but spent much of his professional life in Canada, of course, would ask the same question, and has written, while he was still with us, some very interesting works. P.S. Reddy, who's now a South African academic, of course, has done the same. But I agree with you. The Indian civil service is based on the pattern, the template, much modernized, that was set by Thomas Babington Macaulay 150 years ago or more. Very proudly seeks to be neutral, very proudly seeks to serve the state rather than a political party or any particular ideology. Like all public administrations, sometimes is more successful than others. And I completely agree with you. There should be more on this. If I get a second edition, that would be a very key chapter, I think.
Good. The other big geographical area which I think we're missing in public administration at the moment is Africa. And I know from discussions with my late colleague, who unfortunately has just died from COVID, Richard Tambalasi from Malawi, who worked with me in Manchester for a while. One of the problems in Africa has always been that public administration scholars have been extremely limited in what they can publish because of the regimes they live under. And I wondered whether during the process of developing the book, you'd had any of those sorts of conversations with African scholars.
I did, and of course I can't name them, precisely the reason you've just outlined. There was due to be more than one chapter specifically on sub-Saharan Africa. Right. A previous version of this book, which was Civil Service Systems, had North Africa. A colleague wrote a very interesting chapter on Egypt and modern Egypt. But I wanted to get some sub-Saharan African experience. And in particular, I think a very interesting area is the Republic of South Africa, because of course, in the post-apartheid era, you had a long period led by the excellent Minister for Public Administration, Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, which was going against the old apartheid regime to modernize it with a very good group of scholars who had become civil servants working with her. And I wanted to try and capture all of that. I wasn't able to persuade some of those scholars to come on board. And to countries in the north, some of the issues that you've outlined were also a problem. So next time, I think we can devote a much bigger book to large chunks of research on India. And of course, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which have developed, which began under a very similar system and developed quite differently. It'd be interesting to explore why that has occurred and in which ways that's occurred, but also the different parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, some of the more open countries, which are the Anglophone countries, I think will be keen to contribute, but watch this space.
Good, good. The point about South Africa actually moves on nicely to something else I wanted to talk about, which is one of the issues where I think we've been weak in public administration is on understanding transitions between regime types. And obviously in South Africa, you had the huge transition from apartheid to post-apartheid democratic system. But we've seen other transitions taking place in Eastern Europe, first of all, from communist rule to becoming democratic states and joining the EU and NATO and all the other things that they've done. But then we've also seen democratic backsliding in places like Hungary and Poland. And I think one of the areas of weakness traditionally has been our understanding of those sorts of transitions between regime types and what effect that has on public administration. And there's sort of tended to be an assumption that there's just some sort of continuity in the public administrations, and that's clearly not the case. No. And more recently, we've had the same sort of problem in countries like Britain and America with the rise of populist nationalist governments and them starting to challenge some of the norms of public administration that we've been used to.
I agree. And there are some excellent scholars in Eastern Europe who've been tracking the changes in their countries and neighboring countries. I'm thinking in particular of the Estonians, for example. Tiina Randma has written a huge amount on this, charting the changes in small states and mapping it across other regions. And her colleague, Talon too, of course, who's written in this book, Wolfgang Dreschler, highly critical of the sacred cows, as he calls them, in public administration, saying, look, things are not as we pretend they are. We need to understand why change occurs in the way that it does. And sometimes, as you say, is regressive. But also, I think, I mentioned just now the difference between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But if we look at the former Soviet Empire, the difference between the states is quite marked. The difference between somewhere like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan is different between them. But then if you look at Estonia, obviously a much smaller state, fewer raw materials, but highly digitized, one of the most digitally advanced and democratically advanced countries in the world. And you need to ask, how has Estonia done this and other former republics not been able to? And one of the reasons is the public administration system they've adopted, which nurtures innovation and protects society in a way that the old Soviet system clearly was not able to do.
No, I've done some work in Estonia, and a couple of things struck me about the change that happened. First of all, because of the language issue and them requiring senior civil servants to be able to speak Estonian, where a lot of the Russian-speaking Estonians who had been running the public administration under the Soviet regime were effectively displaced. And a lot of the people who came in had actually been trained in Western public administration schools and had gone back to Estonia as a result of the transition. And that was a huge change. The other thing that astonished me is I was able to go into the cabinet room where they have their meetings, and it's entirely paperless. They have computer screens set into the desks for all the cabinet members, and it's a really interesting system. We sort of need to come towards a conclusion, but we can't stop without talking about COVID, because that's happened since the book was published. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the consequences of the COVID pandemic and the way in which public administration, both actual public administration and scholarship about public administration, have reacted to this. I did a series of interviews last year with people about what was going on in various countries around it. And it strikes me that there's quite a big agenda here about thinking about how the state copes with these sorts of crises.
ask that, Colin. I'm glad you've given us 3 hours for this interview, because I have a lot of observations on this. It's one of the reasons I think why the book has been put into paperback is because the authors, it's not me, it's the authors, were very forward thinking in the way they were asking the questions. What is the role of the state? These are Socratic questions that humanity's been asking itself for thousands of years, and they were, of course, coming up with modern suggestions in using modern technology and the modern issues, some of which are things we've just talked about. And I think what COVID has suggested is that we can go in many different directions. One is to have a more statist system, again, to go back almost to a neo-Weberian set of structures. And a lot of people are calling for that. They're saying, look, we let the public sector wither on the vine. We need to recognize that there's a seamless web of circumstance. You can't just have good central government and good private sector. You have to have local government, health sector, bring on the education, the technology. Most of all, forget all these things about lean delivery and just in time. You need to have a strategic reserve. And when you don't, you get the collapse in some parts of the public sector. That's one set of arguments, and they cover a whole range of perspectives. The other is, well, look how bad the states were at doing this, by which I mean not the United States, but governments. We need to strengthen the private sector. We need to enhance globalization so we can bring in more things from abroad. You know, Britain got its vaccines first because you had multinational teams working within the United Kingdom, but drawing on resources and manufacturing around Europe and indeed in other parts of the world. And there's truth to be said, there's evidence for both. And I think it's going to be quite some time before we get some long range research, which is where our next lot of research should be, which tells us what is going to be most effective at dealing with these kinds of unforeseen circumstances. Although, of course, they're not unforeseen. We know there are always going to be wars. We know there are going to be even more viruses released. They're going to come from companion animals, dogs and cats. And they're going to come from, you know, more fruit bats in different parts of the world. They're going to come from all kinds of places. There's going to be climate change crises. We like to think we live in a safe world, but we don't. So we need to work out ways in which public administration can deliver security, deliver protection, and deliver good governments without becoming too authoritarian, or indeed becoming authoritarian at all.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Somebody summed it up to me. I can't for the life of me remember who it was, as saying that we spent the last 30 or 40 years thinking about efficiency, and we now need to start thinking about resilience an awful lot more. And I thought that really summed it up rather nicely. But I also think your point about the relationship between the private sector and the state, and how that can be a productive relationship, or it can actually be a very destructive relationship in the wrong circumstances, is something that we need to explore a lot more. And there are some people beginning to do that. So I look forward to the next edition of the book. It should be very interesting. Thanks very much for joining me today, Andrew. That's been really useful.
Thank you for inviting me, Colin.
Thank you.